Lila's boots crunched softly over the dry earth of Cedar Ridge, the sun high above casting long shadows across the town. It was a place she hadn't chosen, but one she had been drawn to by circumstance, as often happens in the lives of people like her. The town was small, too small, perhaps, for anyone to truly disappear, but that was exactly what she needed, a place to hide, a place to escape. She had arrived at dawn. Her heart ached with every step she took, but she remained stoic. She had always been good at hiding her feelings. The long journey had left her weary, the weight of her past bearing down on her with each movement. The dust kicked up around her as she moved past the weathered homes and empty streets. No one was out this early. No one paid attention to her arrival. They wouldn't have looked up even if they had seen her. She walked to the modest boarding house at the end of the road, a small, simple building that seemed just as tired as she was. The woman who ran the place, Mrs. Harper, was kind enough to show her to a room, though there was no warmth in her voice, no sense of curiosity about Lila's presence. It was clear she had seen many weary travelers pass through Cedar Ridge and had learned not to ask questions. Lila set her bag down by the bed. The only sound in the room was the soft creak of the old wood floor beneath her feet. She stood there for a moment, staring out the window. The town was quiet, too quiet. She felt as though she had already begun to blend into its fabric, invisible to the world. But invisibility was a comfort, she thought. At least no one would see the weight she carried. She sank into the bed, her body aching from the journey. As she lay there in the stillness, the familiar ache in her chest began to stir again. She closed her eyes, but the darkness that followed wasn't restful. It was the kind of dark that came with memories, memories she had tried so hard to bury. In this town, she would have the time and space to heal, or perhaps just the space to feel the pain without anyone asking why she hurt. Either way, it was enough for now. Lila woke to the quiet murmur of life outside her window. The first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the faded curtains, casting a soft glow over the room. She had slept little, her mind too restless to find any true rest. Still, she rose, preparing herself for the day, though there was no real anticipation in her heart, only the dull resignation that followed each new beginning. The town was small, with only a few scattered buildings that had seen better days. The people of Cedar Ridge moved through their routines, heads down, eyes fixed on their tasks. Lila was no different. She kept her gaze low, hoping to avoid the attention of those who might wonder why she had come, why she was here, alone. She wasn't ready to face any questions, not yet. She made her way to the general store for a few supplies, her steps slow and deliberate. As she entered, the bell above the door jingled softly. A few heads turned, but only for a moment. The shopkeeper, a woman in her 50s with graying hair, didn't speak as she placed the items on the counter. There was no smile, no warm greeting, just the sound of the woman's hands moving swiftly, calculating the price of the goods without a word. Lila fumbled with the coins in her pocket, dropping them on the counter with a soft clink. The woman didn't even look up. The transaction was completed with the efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times. And as Lila turned to leave, the shopkeeper's eyes flickered briefly toward her. There was no recognition in them, only the distant, practiced indifference of someone who had learned not to care. Outside, the world seemed indifferent as well. The dusty streets lay still, and the few townsfolk that passed her by did so with no more than a glance. They had seen her, but they had not truly seen her. She was just another stranger passing through. Lila stood on the corner, watching the people move like clockwork, each wrapped in their own world, their own stories. She didn't feel like she belonged here, didn't feel like she was meant to be part of this. The air was thick with the weight of untold stories, unspoken things, and Lila could feel it in her bones. There was no room for her here, no place for someone like her. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was where she was meant to be. As she walked back to her room, the silence of the town settled around her once more. The air felt heavier than it had before, and Lila's chest tightened with the familiar ache she had been carrying for so long. She longed for someone, anyone, to notice her, to ask if she was okay. But there was no one. The town, like her, had closed its eyes, and that suited her just fine. For now. The days stretched on in Cedar Ridge, each one blending into the next. Lila went about her routines with quiet resignation, moving through the motions of life as if they were nothing more than obligations. Each day, she woke early, bathed in the cool water from the pump behind the boarding house, and prepared her modest breakfast alone. She spent most of her time wandering the streets, avoiding eye contact, keeping to herself. There was no need to seek out others. They had already made it clear that they didn't want her here. The weight of her grief pressed against her chest, but she hid it well. No one asked her how she was doing, and no one seemed to care. She couldn't blame them. In a town this small, people were used to each other's burdens. They didn't have the time to stop and notice someone like her, someone with a past they weren't willing to question. She walked through the town's dry streets every day, the dust rising up around her boots with each step. She avoided the townsfolk, her eyes fixed firmly ahead as she passed them. She didn't want to be noticed. She didn't want their pity, their questions. She would rather stay in the shadows, unnoticed and alone. But it wasn't just the town that ignored her. It was the weight of her own soul that seemed to turn away from her. Each step she took, each breath she drew, felt like a reminder of everything she had lost. She had left behind a life that was suffocating her. Yet even here, in this new place, she found herself trapped in the same pattern. The memories that clung to her like a heavy cloak wouldn't let her go. It was in these moments, when the pain felt unbearable, that she would retreat to the small, empty room at the boarding house. There, in the silence of her four walls, she would let herself break down. Her face would crumble as the tears would come. Silent and bitter. But they would never last long. She would wipe them away, pulling herself back together before anyone could see the cracks. Lila had grown skilled at hiding her pain from the world, but sometimes it felt like the weight of it would crush her. She had learned over the years to bury her grief in silence. But it wasn't just sadness she carried with her. There was a deep loneliness, too. A hollow ache inside her chest that made her feel as though she had no place in this world. She had no one left to care for her, no one who would notice when she faltered. But then there was Caleb. She saw him from a distance, a figure standing alone at the forge. He was a man of few words, someone who didn't seem interested in the town's gossip or the noise that filled the streets. He was quiet, like her. And there was something in the way he stood there, his broad shoulders bent over his work, that made Lila pause. He wasn't looking at her, but something in the way he moved, slow, deliberate, without rushing, made her think he saw her in a way no one else did. The brief glance they shared across the street one afternoon, when she was gathering firewood behind the chapel, left an impression on her. He didn't look away quickly, as most people did. There was no judgment in his gaze, just a quiet, steady kind of watching. It was as if he was waiting for her to make a move, or perhaps waiting for her to acknowledge something he already understood. But she hadn't yet. She didn't know how. She had always kept people at arm's length, afraid that if she let them in, they would see too much of the damage. And Caleb, with his weathered hands and silent presence, seemed like a man who had seen more than his fair share of pain, a man who had learned to carry his burdens in silence. Still, Lila felt drawn to him, to the quiet in his movements, the way his gaze never seemed to search for anyone but the world around him. It was a kind of peace she had never known, but even that, she thought, was something she couldn't have. She had no right to it. As the days went on, the ache inside her deepened, but she continued to keep her distance from Caleb and from everyone else. Cedar Ridge might have closed its eyes to her, but she had already closed her heart to them. It seemed safer that way. It was a quiet morning when Lila first truly noticed Ethan. The sun had barely risen over Cedar Ridge, casting long shadows on the ground as she walked toward the chapel. The air was still, and the usual sounds of the town were muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. She had just finished gathering firewood and was heading back to the boarding house when she saw him standing under the blacksmith's awning. Ethan stood alone, his broad shoulders framed by the faint glow of the early light. His expression was unreadable, but there was something about the way he moved, slow and deliberate, as if every action was purposeful, measured. Lila paused for a moment, unsure whether to continue on her path or turn back. She didn't want to attract attention, but there was something about him that made her pause. His presence was quiet, steady, like the earth itself. His eyes met hers for a brief moment, and she felt a flutter in her chest, something she hadn't felt in a long time. It was only a second, and then his gaze shifted away, back to the task at hand. His hands were busy, working with the hot metal in front of him, the rhythmic clang of his hammer on the anvil filling the air. He didn't look at her again, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he had noticed her in that fleeting instant, just as she had noticed him. For a moment, she felt exposed, vulnerable. But then, the feeling passed, and she carried on, walking back to the boarding house as if nothing had happened. But it was as if the town itself had shifted in that brief moment. For the first time, it didn't feel so heavy, so suffocating. Over the next few days, Lila saw Ethan more often. He was always alone, always in motion, always working with his hands. She saw him in the evenings, standing by the blacksmith's shop, sometimes just watching the horizon. And once, she saw him leaving the chapel after Sunday service, standing in the doorway, watching the townsfolk file out. But he never approached her. He never spoke, and she never found the courage to speak to him either. Yet each time their paths crossed, Lila couldn't help but feel a strange pull, a quiet sense of connection that she couldn't explain. It wasn't that she felt pity for him, or that she thought he was somehow like her. It was more than that. There was something in his stillness, in the way he moved through the world, that made her wonder if he, too, understood the weight of silence, the kind of silence that spoke louder than words ever could. But Ethan never made any move to break the silence between them. He kept his distance, as she did. And in that there was a strange comfort. There was no need for words between them, just the unspoken understanding that they both carried burdens that didn't need to be shared. Still, that first look, the brief moment when their eyes met, lingered in her mind. It was a small thing, easily dismissed by the busy town and the people who lived in it. But for Lila, it felt like something significant, a shift, however small, in the way the world seemed to see her. She tried to ignore it. She told herself that it was just a glance, that it meant nothing. But as the days wore on, she found herself watching for him, hoping for another fleeting moment, another glance. But Ethan never looked at her the same way again. It was on an afternoon of soft winds and faded sunlight when Lila first spoke the words aloud. She was sitting on the bottom step behind the chapel, her knees pulled to her chest, trying to catch a moment of peace in the midst of her solitude. Her hands were rough from the tasks she had been forced to perform in the days since her arrival, chopping wood, scrubbing stone steps, carrying water. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her moving, to keep her mind distracted, though it did little to ease the ache in her heart. As she sat, she shifted her weight, her hips pressing into the stone. A sharp, unbearable pain shot through her, making her wince, and she bit her lip to hold back a cry. She had grown so used to it, to the dull throb that had been a constant companion for weeks, even months now, that it felt like just another part of her. But today, for some reason, it hurt more than usual. It was as though the weight of it had settled deeper into her bones. It hurts when I sit. The words came out in a whisper, almost too soft for anyone to hear. The wind carried them away before they could reach anyone's ears, except for one person's. From across the road, leaning against the blacksmith's awning, Ethan had been watching her, as he often did. His dark eyes, hidden behind the shadow of his hat, fixed on her as the words left her lips. She had not meant for anyone to hear, but the quiet honesty in her voice had drawn his attention. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Ethan did not approach, did not speak. He simply watched, his gaze steady and unreadable. It was as if he could feel the weight of her words, the depth of the pain that she had kept hidden for so long. Lila felt a shiver run down her spine, and she quickly looked away, embarrassed by the vulnerability she had just allowed to slip through. The town had closed its eyes to her, had never asked her about the pain she carried. She had learned to live with it quietly, to hide it behind the stiff facade of a woman trying to make her way in a world that had no place for her. But in that one moment, she had been seen, and she hated it. She stood up quickly, brushing the dust from her skirt, and walked toward the corner of the street. Her heart raced, the pain in her body forgotten for the moment as she tried to escape the weight of Ethan's gaze. It wasn't that she feared him. It was the feeling of being noticed, being seen for the first time in a long while. She wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Ethan, for his part, didn't follow her. He didn't make any move to reach out. He remained where he was, standing silently in the fading light, as he had always done. His presence a quiet, steady thing that never asked for anything in return. But that was the thing about Ethan. He never asked. And in that way, he was different from everyone else in Cedar Ridge. Lila didn't know why, but the way he had watched her felt like an invitation. An invitation to acknowledge the things she had spent so long ignoring. Her pain, her grief, the emptiness she had buried deep inside her. The town had closed its eyes to her, but Ethan had seen her, and that terrified her more than anything. As she made her way back to the boarding house, her chest tightened with a mixture of fear and longing. She told herself that she would forget about it, that it didn't matter. But it did matter, and she wasn't sure if that made her feel stronger or weaker. For the first time, Since her arrival in Cedar Ridge, Lila felt as though she wasn't invisible anymore. But that wasn't a feeling she knew how to embrace. The days passed slowly, each one a quiet repetition of the last. The routines of Cedar Ridge and Lila's place within them became more familiar, but still, she felt like an outsider. The townspeople didn't acknowledge her beyond the occasional nod, and though she had become accustomed to their indifference, it never failed to sting. It was as though they saw her not as a person, but as a fixture, a shadow moving through their lives without leaving a mark. Lila kept to herself as best she could, her days spent in the solitude she had grown so used to. She worked in silence, and when she ventured out, it was always with her head down, trying to avoid drawing attention to herself. But despite her best efforts, the memory of Ethan's gaze, the way he had seen her in a way no one else had, lingered in the back of her mind. She tried to push it away, to tell herself that it didn't matter. But there were moments when it would rise to the surface, unbidden. A brief thought, a passing memory of that soft whisper of her pain carried across the street. It was late one afternoon when it happened. Lila was standing at the well, her arms aching from hauling the heavy bucket of water. The sun was beginning to set, casting the sky in hues of amber and pink, but the air was still and dry. She had just finished drawing the last of the water when she felt a shift in the atmosphere around her. A presence, not quite felt but sensed, as if the air itself had thickened. She looked up, startled to find Ethan standing a few paces away, his broad form silhouetted against the fading light. He was looking at her, but his gaze was different this time, not with the quiet observation that had marked their previous encounters, but with something more. "Need help with that?" he asked, his voice low, barely above a murmur. Lila hesitated, surprised by his sudden appearance. She had never expected him to speak to her directly, let alone offer help. She wasn't used to receiving anything, let alone kindness from someone who had no reason to give it. She opened her mouth to refuse, to say she could manage on her own. But the words didn't come. Instead, she nodded silently. Without another word, Ethan stepped forward and took the bucket from her hands, his fingers brushing hers in a fleeting, almost imperceptible touch. She froze at the contact, but his touch was gentle, not intrusive. He simply moved beside her, taking the weight of the bucket and walking toward the edge of the street where the water was to be poured. Lila watched him in silence, her chest tightening with an unfamiliar feeling. She didn't know what to make of it. This small act of kindness that felt heavier than any burden she had carried. It was nothing grand, nothing that would make the world stop. But to her, it felt like a lifeline thrown into the quiet, empty void she had been living in. When they reached the small trough where the water was to be emptied, Ethan set the bucket down with a soft thud and turned to her. "You don't have to do everything alone," he said, his voice steady, as though he had seen her struggle without ever saying a word. Lila felt something shift within her, something that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. The walls she had built around her heart were beginning to crack, slowly but surely. She had spent so long hiding, pretending that she didn't need anyone, that she could bear the weight of her grief and pain alone. But in that moment, Ethan's simple gesture made her realize just how much she had been denying herself, how much she had been afraid to reach out. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She had never been good with words, never known how to express the emotions that churned inside her. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel the need to say anything at all. She didn't have to explain herself, didn't have to justify her silence. Ethan had simply shown up when she least expected it, and that was enough. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the quiet of the evening. Ethan nodded, giving her a small, almost imperceptible smile before turning and walking back toward the blacksmith shop. He didn't linger, didn't wait for more words, and Lila didn't ask for any. He had given her what she needed most, a moment of kindness, a reminder that even in the silence there was still the possibility of connection. As Lila stood there, watching him disappear into the shadows, she felt a strange weight lift from her shoulders. It wasn't that all her pain had disappeared, it hadn't. But for the first time, she realized she wasn't alone in it. There were others who saw her, who noticed her, even if only in the smallest, most subtle ways. And in that realization, Lila felt a spark of hope, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in far too long. The days that followed were quieter than before. Lila couldn't quite place why, but there was a shift in the air between her and Ethan. He didn't approach her directly again, but she often saw him from a distance, working at the forge, standing by the blacksmith's shop, or walking the streets of Cedar Ridge with a purposeful, slow stride. Each time their paths crossed, their eyes would meet for the briefest of moments, and it was as if they were communicating in ways that words couldn't express. There were no grand conversations, no overt gestures. Yet with every passing day, Lila began to sense something in Ethan, a quiet understanding. It was as though, without words, they had both acknowledged the weight of the silence between them. And in that silence, there was comfort. Lila wasn't sure what to make of it. She had never been someone to trust easily, had never allowed anyone to get close enough to see her brokenness. But there was something about Ethan's presence that didn't push, didn't demand. It was as though he too carried some invisible weight, something unspoken. And in that shared burden, there was no need for further explanation. One evening, as the town settled into the soft hush of twilight, Lila found herself walking along the edge of the main street. The air was cool, and the quiet rustling of the prairie winds was the only sound that filled the space. She passed the blacksmith shop, where the dim light from the forge flickered through the small window. Ethan was inside, working by the glow of the fire. His movements were slow and deliberate, the rhythmic strike of his hammer against the anvil filling the air. Lila paused for a moment, just outside the doorway. She didn't step inside, didn't want to intrude, but she couldn't help but watch him. There was something oddly soothing about the way he worked, focused, steady, as though he could lose himself in the rhythm of it all. And maybe that was something they both shared, the desire to get lost in the quiet, to escape the noise and the pain. As if sensing her presence, Ethan glanced up. Their eyes met, and in that fleeting second, Lila felt something shift again. But this time it was softer, gentler, like a shared understanding, an acknowledgement of each other's solitude. Without a word, Ethan set down his hammer and walked toward the door, his long strides bringing him closer to Lila. There was no hurry in his movements. No urgency, just the slow, deliberate approach of a man who knew the value of quiet space. When he reached her, he stopped just short of the doorway. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt thick, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if they both understood that silence was just as important as words. "Evening," Ethan said softly, his voice steady and low. Lila nodded, unable to find the words to say. But the small gesture felt like an answer in itself. She wasn't alone in this place, in this silence. There was no need for explanation. They didn't need to say more. Ethan's gaze lingered on her for a moment, and Lila could see a hint of something in his eyes. Perhaps a question, or a curiosity about her that was left unspoken. But he didn't press. He simply nodded again, the unspoken understanding between them deepening. "I'm here if you need anything," he said quietly, his tone firm but not intrusive. Lila didn't respond immediately. She just stood there for a moment, her heart racing with something she couldn't quite name. She had never been good at asking for help, never been able to reach out to others for fear of being seen as weak. But Ethan's offer was different. It wasn't pity. It wasn't a demand. It was simply an offer of presence, of quiet support. "Thank you," Lila whispered after a long pause, her voice barely audible in the cool evening air. Ethan nodded once more and turned back toward the forge, his movements steady and deliberate once again. He didn't look back, but Lila didn't need him to. The connection between them didn't require words, didn't require anything more than the simple acknowledgement that they had both seen each other. Really seen each other for the first time. As Lila continued her walk down the street, she felt a shift inside her, a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. The beginning of trust. It wasn't much, but it was enough for her to realize that, for the first time since she had arrived in Cedar Ridge, she didn't have to face the silence alone. And that was a start. The days grew warmer, and the quiet rhythm of life in Cedar Ridge continued, as it always had. Lila spent most of her time working, scrubbing the chapel steps, carrying water, tending to her small tasks. But every day there was an undercurrent of something deeper, something she couldn't fully name that pulsed through the stillness. It was Ethan. It wasn't as though they spent much time together, but there was an undeniable tension between them, an unspoken understanding that only grew with each passing day. Their paths crossed often, though always by chance. Lila found herself noticing him more than she intended to. She would catch sight of him in the distance, at the edge of the blacksmith's shop or standing by the street. And for a moment their eyes would meet. It was always brief and always accompanied by a feeling she couldn't shake, a strange kind of warmth that contrasted the cold walls she had built around herself. But it was one evening, as the sun began to set, casting a soft glow over the town, that something changed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a confession, nor an explosion of emotion. But it was a moment, quiet and understated, that left a mark on both of them. Lila had finished her chores for the day and was walking back to the boarding house, her body sore from the work, her mind distracted by the lingering ache of the past. The town was quiet, most people having retreated indoors as night fell. She moved slowly, lost in thought, when she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to find Ethan walking toward her, his pace steady, his hands tucked in his pockets. He wasn't rushing, wasn't trying to catch up. He was simply walking beside her at a distance, as if waiting for her to acknowledge his presence. For a moment, Lila didn't know what to do. She wasn't used to people approaching her, let alone walking with her without an agenda. But then, in that same quiet way that had marked their previous interactions, Ethan spoke. "It's strange," he said, his voice low like the rustling of the wind. "How a person can feel so alone, even when they're surrounded by people." Lila looked at him, startled by the directness of his words. She had never heard anyone speak like that, so simply, so openly. The people in Cedar Ridge didn't talk about such things. They avoided them, just as she had. "I know what you mean," she replied softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She had been caught off guard, but she didn't feel the need to hide the truth. Not with him. Not anymore. They continued walking in silence for a few moments, the space between them comfortable, not awkward. Lila had always been careful with her words, choosing them carefully, but with Ethan, it felt different. She didn't have to explain herself, didn't have to bury the emotions she kept locked away. He glanced at her again, his eyes steady and calm. "You don't have to say anything if you don't want to," he said, his voice offering no pressure, no expectation. "I just thought you might understand." Lila didn't speak right away. She had never been good at talking about what was inside her, but there was something in Ethan's words, something that made her feel less afraid of the silence that often surrounded her. So she took a deep breath, her chest tightening with the weight of years of unspoken pain. "It hurts," she said, her voice barely audible. "It's always there, even when I'm trying to forget." Ethan didn't say anything, but his presence beside her seemed to fill the silence in a way that words never could. They walked a few more steps, their pace slow, as if they both needed time to process what had been said. "You don't have to carry it alone," Ethan said finally, his voice gentle but firm. "I can't promise it'll be easy, but you don't have to carry it alone." The words hit her harder than she expected. It wasn't just the idea of not being alone. It was the idea that someone else might care, that someone else might see her pain and want to share it, even if only in small, quiet ways. Lila swallowed hard, trying to keep her emotions in check. But the dam inside her had cracked, and she could feel the tears threatening to spill. She looked away, trying to blink them back, but it was no use. Ethan had already seen her, and somehow that made it harder to hold it all in. He didn't try to comfort her, didn't reach out or say anything else. He simply kept walking beside her, offering his silent support. The weight of his presence, his quiet understanding, was enough. And for the first time in a long time, Lila felt the walls she had built around herself start to crumble, piece by piece. They walked in silence until they reached the boarding house, and as Lila stepped toward the door, she turned to him. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for just being here." Ethan nodded, his expression soft but steady. "Any time," he said before turning to leave. Lila watched him walk away, her heart feeling strangely lighter. She didn't know where this would lead, didn't know what to make of this strange, quiet bond that was forming between them. But for the first time since she had arrived in Cedar Ridge, Lila felt like she wasn't entirely alone. The days blurred into each other as Lila continued to carve out a quiet existence in Cedar Ridge. The routine of working, eating, and sleeping filled her time, leaving little room for anything else. Yet, despite the monotony, there was an undercurrent of change. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but present nonetheless. The moments with Ethan, though few, had begun to affect her in ways she hadn't expected. It wasn't just that he had shown kindness, though that in itself was enough to stir something within her. It was the way he had looked at her, the way he had quietly acknowledged her pain without demanding anything in return. He hadn't tried to fix her or make her feel better. He simply let her be. And for the first time, Lila found herself wishing for more than the solitude she had convinced herself she needed. But with that desire came fear. Fear of opening up. Fear of letting someone in. She had lived too long with her grief to allow it to surface again. The memories of the past, of loss, of betrayal, were still fresh, still raw. And in her quiet moments, when the weight of it all became too much, she found herself questioning whether she could ever truly heal. It was on one such evening that everything seemed to fall apart. Lila had spent the afternoon alone in her room, staring out the window at the sun sinking low behind the hills. The house was quiet, save for the soft creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. She had been avoiding her emotions all day, pushing them down as she always did. But tonight, they refused to stay buried. As the darkness settled outside, Lila found herself at the small table in her room, her hands shaking as she tried to write. The words wouldn't come. The thoughts swirling in her head were too chaotic, too painful. She couldn't put them on paper, couldn't make sense of them. She had tried so hard to keep everything together, to hold on to the fragments of herself that hadn't been shattered. But now, as she sat there, the weight of her past came crashing in on her all at once. The tears came without warning, spilling down her cheeks in a rush. She wiped them away quickly, but they kept coming, unbidden, unstoppable. Her chest tightened, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. She had never allowed herself to cry like this before, to let the grief, the anger, and the pain out. She had always held it inside, believing that if she just kept it buried long enough, it would eventually go away. But it never did. She stood abruptly, knocking the chair back as she walked to the window. The cool night air washed over her as she leaned against the frame, looking out at the distant stars. She didn't know what she was searching for, what she expected to find. All she knew was that the silence of Cedar Ridge had become too much to bear, too heavy with the weight of her unspoken emotions. That's when she heard it, the soft sound of footsteps behind her. She turned, startled, to find Ethan standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim light from the hallway. I thought you might need some air," he said quietly, his voice low and steady, as though he had known exactly what she needed before she even knew it herself. Lila didn't say anything. She couldn't. Her throat felt tight, her chest heavy, but she didn't turn away from him either. His presence was a quiet comfort, a steadying force that seemed to ground her in a way nothing else had. Ethan stepped into the room without hesitation, his gaze never leaving hers. He didn't try to comfort her, didn't try to make her feel better. He simply stood there, waiting, giving her the space she needed without pushing. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Lila's chest heaved with each breath, the weight of her emotions threatening to consume her. She had spent so long carrying them alone, so long convinced that no one could ever truly understand her pain. But in this moment, with Ethan standing silently by her side, she realized that maybe she didn't have to carry it all by herself anymore. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan shook his head, his eyes soft and understanding. "You don't have to apologize," he said. "You're allowed to feel." The words were simple, but they hit Lila harder than she expected. She had spent so much time denying herself the right to feel the anger, the grief, the sadness that had consumed her for so long. But Ethan's words gave her permission, not to wallow in it, but to acknowledge it, to allow herself to be human again. She closed her eyes, her hands trembling at her sides, and for the first time in a long time, Lila let herself lean into the pain. She didn't have to hide it anymore. She didn't have to face it alone. Ethan stood there silent and steady as she cried, tears she had kept hidden for so long finally finding their way to the surface. He didn't ask questions, didn't try to fix her. He just let her be, and that was enough. When the tears finally slowed, Lila took a deep, shaky breath and wiped her eyes. She looked at Ethan, her face flushed, her chest still tight from the release. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel quite so broken. "I don't know what to do with all of this," she admitted, her voice hoarse. Ethan's response was simple, but it was exactly what she needed to hear. "One step at a time," he said softly. "One step at a time." And in that quiet moment, Lila realized that maybe, just maybe, she could begin to heal. Not all at once and not without struggle, but with time and with the right kind of support. The weeks that followed were not marked by any sudden, dramatic changes. Lila's life in Cedar Ridge remained a quiet one, filled with routine and work. But there was a shift within her, a subtle transformation, like the slow thaw of winter when warmth begins to touch the frozen earth. The pain didn't vanish, but it began to feel more manageable, less like an overwhelming weight. She still had days when the ache in her chest would return, when the grief would rise up like a tide, threatening to drown her. But there was something new now, the quiet presence of Ethan, always there when she needed him most. Though their interactions remained brief, they had become familiar, and in that familiarity there was an understanding that neither had to articulate. It was as though they had both agreed, without saying a word, that they were there for each other. It wasn't a bond built on grand gestures or promises. It was built on small moments, on shared silences, and the recognition that sometimes simply being present for someone was enough. One evening, as the sky darkened and the stars began to dot the vast expanse above, Lila found herself walking toward the blacksmith's shop again. It was a quiet walk, as always, but tonight there was a tug in her chest, an inexplicable pull that led her there. She had no reason to seek Ethan out, no particular words to say, but something inside her urged her to go. As she approached the forge, she saw him. Ethan was standing by the anvil, hammering away at a piece of metal, his back to her. His movements were methodical, focused. Nothing out of the ordinary. But tonight, there was something different. The quiet hum of the evening seemed to grow louder as she drew closer. Her heart was racing, not with fear, but with the anticipation of something that had been building for weeks, though neither of them had named it. When Ethan finally noticed her, he stopped his work and turned to face her. There was no surprise in his eyes. No uncertainty, just that steady calm that had become so familiar. He wiped his hands on his apron and took a few steps toward her, his eyes locking with hers in that same silent understanding. "You're here," he said, his voice low but warm. Lila nodded, her throat suddenly tight. She didn't know what to say, didn't know if there was anything to say. But the words came anyway, tumbling out before she could stop them. "I've been thinking a lot," she started, her voice shaky at first. "About everything. About what happened, what's happened since I got here. And She paused, taking a breath, trying to steady herself. "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done, for just being here, for not expecting anything from me, for not judging me." Ethan didn't say anything immediately. He simply stood there, looking at her, his expression unreadable, yet soft. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "You don't need to thank me," he said quietly. "I didn't do anything but listen, and that's all you ever needed. I'm not here to fix you, Lila. I'm here to stand with you, to be present, if you'll have me." Lila felt a lump rise in her throat. She had spent so much of her life believing that she had to carry her pain alone, that no one could truly understand the depths of what she had lost. But in Ethan's simple words, she realized how wrong she had been. It wasn't about fixing her. It wasn't about taking the pain away. It was about being there, acknowledging the hurt without trying to erase it. And for the first time in a long time, Lila felt like she could breathe again. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Her hands trembled, but she didn't pull away. She reached out, just a tentative touch on his arm. Ethan didn't flinch, didn't pull back. Instead, he placed his hand over hers, steady and sure, as though this simple touch was enough to convey everything they had both been too afraid to say. Lila swallowed hard, the weight of her emotions threatening to overwhelm her again. But this time, she didn't resist. She allowed herself to feel, allowed herself to lean into the quiet comfort that Ethan offered. "I don't know if I can ever be fully healed," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the still night air. "But with you, I don't feel like I'm carrying it all alone." Ethan squeezed her hand gently, a gesture so small but filled with so much meaning. "You don't have to," he replied softly. The world outside seemed to fade away as they stood there in the quiet of the night, their hands clasped together. There were no grand declarations, no promises, just the simple truth that sometimes healing doesn't come from fixing what's broken. It comes from being seen, from being understood, from having someone by your side who doesn't try to change you, but simply lets you be. For the first time, Lila felt something shift inside her. The walls she had built around herself, the walls that had kept her isolated for so long, were beginning to crack. Slowly, she was allowing herself to trust again. Slowly, she was learning to share her pain, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. And in that quiet, shared moment, Lila realized that maybe, just maybe, she was finally starting to heal. The days that followed the quiet conversation between Lila and Ethan felt different, though not in any immediate, dramatic way. The change was subtle, like a seed slowly taking root in soil that had long been hardened. They didn't speak of what had passed between them. There was no need. The connection between them was already understood, unspoken, and that was enough. Ethan continued his work at the forge, and Lila kept to her daily tasks, but now, when their paths crossed, there was something more, something softer, something gentler. It wasn't just the shared silence between them that brought comfort. It was the simple presence of one another, a presence that spoke volumes without a single word. Lila began to find herself seeking out those moments when she could be near Ethan, even if just for a few moments. Whether it was passing by the blacksmith's shop or walking along the main street, she looked for him in the crowd, hoping for that small, fleeting connection that made the weight of her past feel just a little less unbearable. It wasn't that she was looking for anything more from him. Not yet, anyway. It was simply the quiet companionship that had started to bloom between them. She had spent so much of her life closed off from the world, her heart wrapped in layers of protective armor. But with Ethan, she was beginning to understand that it was okay to let those walls come down, bit by bit. It was okay to need someone. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky was painted with the warm hues of twilight, Lila found herself walking toward the chapel. It was a rare moment of stillness, no work, no distractions, just the peaceful quiet of the evening. As she neared the chapel, she saw Ethan again, standing outside near the steps, looking up at the sky. The evening light softened his features, making him appear almost timeless, like someone who had been a part of the landscape for as long as the hills and the trees. He turned as she approached, his expression neutral but open, as if waiting for her to join him. "You're here?" he said, his voice low but steady. Lila nodded, a soft smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I like the quiet," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's peaceful here." Ethan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked up at the sky, the stars beginning to blink into existence. After a moment, he spoke again, his tone contemplative. "It's strange," he said, his gaze still fixed on the stars above. "How we can spend so much of our lives running from our past, trying to bury it, only for it to follow us wherever we go." Lila's heart tightened in her chest, the words cutting deeper than she expected. She didn't know if Ethan was speaking directly to her, but somehow she knew he was. The weight of the past had always felt like a burden she couldn't shake, no matter how far she ran. It clung to her, every moment, every step, a reminder of what she had lost. "But it doesn't have to define us," he added, his words quiet but certain. "We can choose to move forward, even if it's one small step at a time." Lila looked at him then, really looked at him, at the man who had quietly understood her, who had offered her the space to heal without rushing her, without expecting anything in return. For the first time, she felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could begin to move forward. "I don't know if I can ever fully leave it behind," she confessed, her voice raw. "But I think I'm starting to understand that I don't have to carry it all alone." Ethan turned to her then, his expression soft, his eyes filled with something that Lila couldn't quite name. He didn't say anything. There was no need to. He simply stood there as he always had, offering her the space to breathe, to think, to heal. And in that moment, Lila realized that it wasn't about leaving her past behind completely. It was about learning to live with it, to make peace with it, and to find a way forward, even if it was slow, even if it was difficult. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone in it as she had always thought. The quiet moments with Ethan had taught her that. She wasn't broken beyond repair. She wasn't a lost cause. She was someone who had lived through pain and grief, and she was learning, bit by bit, how to let herself heal. As they stood there together in the evening light, Lila felt something inside her shift, a new understanding, a tentative hope for what lay ahead. She didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a small flicker of peace, and that was enough. The seasons began to change in Cedar Ridge, as they always did, slowly and inevitably. The harsh heat of summer faded into the cool embrace of autumn, and the town, which had always seemed so distant, began to feel a little more like home. Lila continued her work at the boarding house, taking on more tasks as time went by. But it wasn't the work that had changed. It was the space within her, the space she had kept locked away for so long. That, too, had begun to shift. The visits with Ethan remained small, quiet moments, but each one left her with something more. She no longer felt the weight of the past so heavily. It was still there, of course. How could it not be? But she had learned that it didn't have to define her every step. Ethan had shown her that, not with grand gestures or promises, but with his simple, steady presence. They had shared little more than a handful of conversations, yet it felt as though they had known each other for a lifetime. Their time together was always unhurried, never rushed. There were no expectations, no pressure, just two people finding solace in each other's quiet company. One afternoon, after a particularly long day of work, Lila found herself walking toward the blacksmith's shop again. The sun was setting, the sky painted in shades of purple and gold, and the world seemed to slow around her. She had no particular reason for going, other than the pull she felt every time she passed by. It was a quiet kind of pull, one that had grown stronger with each passing day. As she reached the shop, she saw Ethan standing outside, his sleeves rolled up, wiping his hands on a rag. His gaze lifted as she approached, and a small smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "You've been working hard," he remarked softly, though it was clear he wasn't just referring to her chores. Lila smiled back, her heart warming at the simple acknowledgement. "I guess I have, but it feels easier now," she said quietly, her eyes meeting his. Ethan's gaze softened, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need for words. In the silence, they both understood what had passed between them, what had changed, what had been rebuilt over the past months. The slow healing, the shared moments of understanding had led them to this place, a place where they didn't need to ask anything of each other, but simply to be. Lila took a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs, and felt a sense of calm settle over her. She had never imagined she would find this kind of peace, this kind of quiet understanding. But here, in Cedar Ridge, with Ethan beside her, it was possible. And that was enough. "I'm glad you're here," she said softly, the words slipping out more easily than she had anticipated. I didn't think I could ever feel this way again." Ethan stepped closer, his expression gentle. "You don't have to feel it all at once. We've got time." The words were simple, but they held so much weight. Time. The thing that had always felt so fleeting, so out of reach, now seemed like something they could hold on to. Together. "I'm learning," Lila said, her voice steady, her gaze meeting his. "I'm learning that healing doesn't have to be all at once. It can happen slowly, step by step." Ethan nodded, his hand brushing against hers in the most natural of gestures. The contact was light, but it spoke volumes. They didn't need anything more than what was here, in this moment. Together, they turned to face the setting sun, standing side by side in the quiet of the evening. The world around them seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of them. Two people who had found something in each other they hadn't expected. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with understanding, with acceptance, with a deep connection that didn't require words. As the stars began to appear in the sky, Lila felt a sense of contentment settle over her. It wasn't the kind of contentment that came with grand achievements or changes. It was the kind that came from simply being, from existing in the quiet comfort of knowing that she wasn't alone anymore. And that, for Lila, was enough. The seasons continued to turn, as they always do, and life in Cedar Ridge went on in its quiet, unhurried way. Lila and Ethan didn't need to speak of the changes that had taken place in their lives. They both understood that healing doesn't come with fanfare or announcement. It comes slowly, quietly, like the turning of the earth itself. They spent their days working, finding solace in the simple tasks of life, tending to the shop, caring for the land, sharing meals at the boarding house. They didn't rush, didn't seek anything more than what was in front of them. But in those small, everyday moments, there was an understanding between them that spoke louder than any words ever could. Lila found herself, in time, no longer weighed down by the past. She had not forgotten, of course, but she had learned to carry it with grace, knowing that it did not define her. And with Ethan by her side, she knew she didn't have to carry it alone. As the years passed, Cedar Ridge remained the same, small, quiet, unchanged. But for Lila and Ethan, the town had become a place of renewal, a place of peace. Together they had found the strength to move forward, step by step, learning that healing doesn't come with grand gestures. It comes with time, with presence, and with the quiet understanding that sometimes just being there for someone is enough. And in that, they had found everything they needed.